Muted, Daphne.
No, it's got to happen at least once, right? You guys are all off the hook now. I apologize. Good afternoon. On behalf of the ACEC Research Institute's Board of Directors, welcome to today's Future of Engineering Roundtable. A big thank you to our donors who have made this session possible. We have a great group of thought leaders here today that are going to share their insights and expertise with us on the E in ESG. As Kevin will explain shortly, the E is focused on environment. But I think as we will soon learn from our panelists, there is much more to the E than what we traditionally think of when we think about the environment. So why don't we jump right in? Moderating our session today is Kevin McMahon, who serves as a consultant to the ACEC Research Institute, and he will be assisted by Joe Bates, our research consultant at the Institute, who will handle your questions through the chat box. Kevin, over to you to introduce our panelists and today's topic.
Thank you very much, Daphne. We have a terrific panel of thought leaders in the environmental space right now. And first, I would like to introduce Raj Arora. Raj is CEO for Jensen Hughes, which is a global leader in safety, security, and risk-based engineering and consulting services around the globe. We also have Lindsay X, who is environmental director for the city of Fort Collins, Colorado. One focus area among many for Lindsay is centering equity in air quality, climate, and zero waste solutions. And last but not least, we have Dave Mcdonald, who is Sustainable Solutions Development Leader for Woodward Curran, a leader in integrated consulting, engineering, and sciences, specializing in water and environmental projects. Thank you all for joining us, and we're really looking forward to a great discussion. So just a quick 1-minute summary of what environmental is. Daphne related to this ESG movement. The E stands for environmental impact and sustainability of your firm, and it's one of the main pillars of ESG. It's the E pillar of the movement. And what firms are focusing in on is the carbon footprint of, and a lot of these initiatives also relate to our work for clients. So when you look at this, it's not just firms, but also our work for clients. But it's carbon footprint, the net carbon zero movement. A lot of entities, communities, and companies are making commitments to achieve net carbon zero status by 2040 or 2050. Energy efficiency, reduction in use, increased use of renewables, water and natural resource conservation. And Lindsay specifically has some terrific examples of what's going on out in the West and in Colorado specifically. Improved waste management, reduced impact on biodiversity, and climate-related risk management and sustainability. And as Daphne said, this is becoming much more than environmental services. It's becoming a responsibility and a mindset. It's definitely becoming more top of mind for stakeholders, shareholders, investors, and communities. For employees, our current employees, and also our future employees want to see firms demonstrate leadership in these initiatives. Our clients clearly are looking for help and like-minded firms to work with. And increasingly, all of these stakeholders want to align with the firm's values, and they want to see that the firms demonstrate alignment in the values here. Okay, so let's get started. We have a terrific panel, and we will go back and forth and have a discussion more than just straight questions. And the first question I'll pose to Lindsay, and then to get this discussion going. Lindsay, we've heard about incorporating social equity into mainstream projects. The typical example that I think most of us hear about is the highway that cuts through the impoverished neighborhood. But can you give us other examples of how this plays out in real life in your world on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, you bet. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for having us today. I'm really excited to get to interact with all of you, as well as our awesome panelists today. Kevin, to your question, one of the things we think about as local governments is that we are designed for and aim to serve everyone in our community. And we know that the systems that our country was built on don't serve everyone in the same way today. So that identity is a predictor of one's outcomes in life, whether we're thinking about pay inequality or home ownership rates and those disparities that we see. And so I'm sure, as an example, and I'll get there in a moment, but I'm sure that many of our members know about redlining, right? So that was when our banking systems ranked various parts of our communities based on different factors that drove whether or not you were eligible for a home. And race was a key driver in whether or not you were ranked, your community area was ranked as green, so eligible, or red as ineligible. And Fort Collins wasn't big enough back when redlining was the case to be redlined formally. But if you look at some of our subdivision plats, you can see that who was able to live in a certain part of our community was restricted by race, right? And that's the case in many parts of our country. And so what's fascinating to me as a leader today, I can't fix what we did 80, 100 years ago, right? But I can fix the decisions that we work on today. So we see patterns of where tree canopy is playing out in those same areas that were redlined in our lower income neighborhoods today. So if you're in a higher income area, you're part of that community that was historically for white community members only, you have a more significant tree canopy. And this isn't a Fort Collins phenomenon. There's a study of 108 US communities that were redlined, and looking at them and seeing a real direct correlation between tree canopy today and where areas were redlined. And so when we think about climate change impacts, which I get to think about, and I know many of you think about on a daily basis, when we're thinking about extreme heat, for example, tree canopy, it really matters. And how we invest in our urban forests matters today too, right? And so we have a real opportunity as leaders to bringing that back to how are we serving everyone? What's our legacy in our communities? And how can we change the way we make decisions today? So those are some things that come to mind.
Great. Thanks so much, Lindsay. Raj, I want to ask you a question about your business. One of the skill sets that you guys specialize in is fire related services. And how does fire related services play out to the questions that Lindsay's bringing up with social equity and your involvement in different communities and different places around the globe?
Well, it's a great question, Kevin. And I think we often, and those on the line may often think about, well, what is my place in ESG or in E or the S? And I think all of us represented here today have quite a place, past, present, and future, in how we impact communities and how we impact environmental stewardship, et cetera. And at Jensen Hughes, you mentioned, in the short intro that we are all things safety, security, and risk related. We're best known, as you mentioned, for fire protection engineering. I mean, one of the things I'll mention here is wildfire risk mitigation. Obviously, wildfires are everywhere. They're growing in frequency and scale and severity for sure across the globe. They are causing impacts at what we call the wildland urban interface, where, commercial and urban areas are meeting, where the vegetation is and what the biggest culprit is in the start of wildfire spread. And it's having real social, economic, political impact. When you look at wildfires, it's about an $8.5 to $10.5 billion loss per event, which is amazing. So, this is a real problem that needs to be solved by professionals that are experienced in all things wildfire, and we're fire protection engineers, so we fall into that category, and we're just working with all the stakeholders involved. And as you can imagine, the stakeholders are, the municipalities and the insurers, commercial building owners, utilities, because, all too often the utility assets are what causes this type of event. So we're really focused there from, the early stage mitigation and preparedness to the response and recovery, Kevin. And I just want to ask Dave, when you think about, your place as Woodard and Curran, in the ESG story? You know, you guys are specialty engineers, but a little different. Where do you guys fit in?
Well, I think we're really a lot like most of the other ACEC member firms. Everyone has a right to clean air, everyone has a right to clean water, everyone has a right to a pleasant environment around them. And the really great news is that we have all of these wonderful member firms that stay educated through all of the work they do in their own educational backgrounds as they come into their professional careers, but certainly all the continuing development that goes on, including panels like this, that they're constantly staying out in front of the issues to make sure that when we design, when we plan, when we work on transportation systems, when we put in water plants, when we design infrastructure for the communities around us, that we're doing so with a mindset around the larger benefits to all of the stakeholders. And so I think it's a wonderful story that we've created in this country and globally, such a wonderful network of educated teams and firms ready to take on that challenge. And I think we very much feel our place and our responsibility in that community as much as any of the firms that are watching today.
Thanks, Dave. I want to just go back to Lindsay for, you know, in my travels around the engineering circuit, I haven't heard much about preventing wildfires. I mean, it's something that Raj's firm does a lot of, but a lot of firms don't do it, and it doesn't come up in conversation often. Lindsay, you're out in the West, and I know you've had a significant drought. What are some of the issues that you're facing with this challenge, and what are you doing with your limited budget to address it?
This wildfire specifically?
Yeah, or anything else that's an emerging threat to your survival out there as a thriving community.
I feel like I had a chance during the pandemic. I know many folks were working on things that they weren't, that we called it being redeployed, right? So folks were working on a variety of things. And I was working on our first housing strategic plan as a city during the pandemic. And one of the mantras in the housing world is there is no silver bullet. And I feel like it's the exact same in our world as well, right? There is no silver bullet that's going to magically address wildfire or the risks that we're all facing from climate change in our systems today, right? And so in the West, I don't know how many folks know about this, but at the end of April, the USDA declared 63 of 64 counties in Colorado as a primary disaster area because of longstanding drought. And nerds like me are constantly hitting refresh on the snowpack maps to see how bad is it going to be this year. And so data is really important to us for decision making. We talk a lot about, you know, what is sensible and sustainable water storage is something that we're talking about a lot too, to work on drought. From a wildfire perspective, we know that, especially in an urban area, one of the greatest impacts, we don't have many folks who are right in that WUI, that wildland urban interface, but we certainly do when we're out in the county. But in the urban areas, one of the best things that we can do is provide better information to our community members about the risks that they're facing. And so we see a lot more citizen or community member monitoring a particulate matter in the air, and we're working to put all of that online. We had a fire at our street site the other week, and we were able, our community was asking us, should I go outside? It was a mulch fire, right? Like really localized. And so we were able to look at those PM monitors from across our city and say, no, it's okay, unless you're right next to this wildfire. And yet when we're talking about the wildfires on the scale that Raj works on, that those impacts can be very expansive. And so we can see where are those patterns and in which neighborhoods should we be changing. As a local government, we aren't having our employees go outside on certain days. So we're changing our internal practices too. Kevin, I'm curious if I'm getting at what you're hoping for me to answer. I think some other climate change impacts that we discuss are extreme heat and other ones too, but direct me to where you want to go, or Dave and Raj jump in too.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. I want to just take the discussion a little bit along the lines to follow up on what you described for Dave and Raj about how I think engineering firms generally need to look at the broader impact of projects today than just what a client maybe hires us to specifically do. Without even saying so, I think clients want us to look beyond what's the obvious and come in with some other things that perhaps the client didn't recognize, or wasn't a challenge identified at the beginning. Dave, can you just highlight a few things that your firm is doing to alert the broader project participants that are not specifically environmental folks in your firm to look at a project from a bigger footprint and look at it, how it impacts the broader community?
Well, I think for our whole industry, there's been a shift in how you need to help the clients that you interact with. I know, when I started in my career, it was have great engineering services and be very responsive to what the client is asking for. I think today, what we all need to do as firms is help accelerate our clients' success toward their goals. And that means you need to really understand what their goals are. So my answer broadly to your question, Kevin, is that where we may have had a one-to-one relationship, engineer to engineer, with our clients in the past, I think we now need to create many-to-many relationships in the client organization so we truly understand their goals and the challenges that they're working with. And then we need to bring the experience from all the other client interactions that we have across our portfolio to bear, so that every client we work with gets the benefit of all of that information. But it really starts with doing a lot of listening, and doing a lot of listening in a lot of different places inside the client organizations. And oftentimes that means not just the engineering department.
Yeah, I agree with that. Raj, can you pile on a little bit to what Dave and Lindsay have said in this matter?
Yeah, I mean, just pulling the thread that you put out there in terms of how are we getting our engineers and consultants to think a little bit more broadly beyond, the traditional scope of work to help add value on this ESG front. And first of all, the fire protection engineering and safety engineering industry is old school, and everybody on the line is probably like, yeah, we're old school as well. But I'm saying this is really old school, folks. It's code driven. There's some performance-based alternatives, and folks just, are pretty strict about following the regulations and the codes. So there's not a lot of latitude there. However, and this bleeds into something I know we're going to talk about a little bit later, is we have a unique advantage as our company to have technology available in addition to our services. And what we want our consultants to do is continue to encourage our clients to think about the use of technology and software in the work that we do, but also to adhere to it, adopt the technology themselves after we leave, to manage the whole life cycle of the particular risk that we're working on. And technology in general, and I know folks on the line are using technology internally probably to be more productive. I don't know how many of the participants are selling technology, whether it's their own or third parties, but obviously the use of technology helps you increase quality ultimately, and in our case, reduce risk, but then unlock all this other value that's downstream. So one for us is operational efficiencies, which always gets people to spend more money because they are saving money in the process. But two, then how do you take that data that you continue to gather, in real time and use that in new ways to unlock value and to solve for, environmental stewardship and decarbonization and such. So it's all about technology at our company and how we encourage our clients to adopt those in our work and then downstream when our work is done.
Great, Raj. Thanks. Joe, pausing to ask you if there's any questions out there in the audience that you'd like to pose.
Yeah, thanks. We've got a couple questions all surrounding the same topic. I think it's geared more toward Lindsay, but definitely would love to hear Raj and Dave's perspective as well.
Lindsay's the main event. We know that. Dave and I are just the undercard. So
So the question is, Lindsay, when you are reviewing proposals or you're working with your teams to review proposals from engineering firms, are you looking more at the experience they have with dealing in environmental projects? Or are you also looking at what they do as an organization to perhaps, show that they're also committed to environmental stewardship?
Thanks for that question. So the honest answer is it's an and, right? So it's both. And I think I'll make sure if I don't get there that I talk about the risks we're willing to take in this space. So what I would say, big picture, and I know this isn't the case for every local government, but we're pretty lucky in the staff team that we have. Here, we have a lot of technical expertise. And so if I'm going to bring somebody in-house, we're going to look for somebody who's going to absolutely what Dave was saying earlier, like deliver those results, but also push us, right? How are you going to help us grow? So we've got pretty amazing capital CIP planning processes, right? We haven't incorporated equity into those. We haven't incorporated greenhouse gas emissions reduction into those. We haven't incorporated resilience to climate change into those. And here's what I'm sensing, not a lot of firms have either, right? And how can we grow together, right? And so that's where I'm looking at, if we're in a riskier space, if I'm looking at a suite of proposals that nobody has that specific experience, then that commitment that you have to ESG and triple bottom line thinking becomes something, who are we going to want to work with? Who aligns with our values, right? And so for instance, we have specific points in our RFP criteria around sustainability. And we define that in a very similar way that ESG does. We're triple bottom line in our community. So it's great that you recycle, but that's bare minimum these days, right? Like what we're looking for is, how are you driving an inclusive culture within your workforce? How are you serving every community member in your projects, right? How are you making decisions differently? How is your firm reducing emissions? So those are some of the things that I would say on that one. So experience matters. And one of the analogies I always love to do, especially as a mama, is like crawl, walk, and then run. And in many of these spaces, we're in the crawling space, right? Like we don't have best practices, or the scale of the problem would be in a completely different space globally, right? And so really, who do we want to crawl and walk together with is really important for us. So seeing that commitment, seeing your values is really important. Joe, do you think that gets at the question as you saw it?
Yeah, absolutely. And Raj and Dave, if you have anything to add from your perspective on the side, where you've seen other clients and what they're looking at, love to hear your perspective as well.
yeah, I can jump in real quick and take a different angle to it and just say that in my experience in this space, my short experience, because this has kind of taken on its own life pretty quickly and accelerating, but thought leadership has been extremely important for us at Jensen Hughes. So the majority of the cases, people are calling us, folks like Lindsay or our clients, and saying, we saw you write this blog, or we heard your podcast, or help us here. And that turns into an opportunity. And sometimes we're helping them early stage and then we're competing downstream just like everybody else. But I would just encourage folks that are thinking about the space and thinking about how to get more active is to do those things, speak at conferences, write blogs, do podcasts. I recently did the ACEC podcast with Jeff Urbanic, and believe it or not, real story, I got a call 2 weeks ago from the CEO of a very major healthcare system in the US, who wants me to meet with him, which is happening next week, to talk about how we can influence their ESG agenda, because they Googled engineering and ESG, and I guess ACEC search engine optimization is so great, it popped up first, and we had already done business with them, so they knew our brand. So anyway, I just wanted to mention that thought leadership, I think, is really important in order to get more at-bats in this area. Dave, over to you.
Sure. I would just say the question really speaks to what I think a lot of member firms are asking: how quickly do I need to come up to speed with this? And I will just say, we absolutely see these criteria in the RFPs these days. I think that's the right thing to have happen. I'll also point out that the move toward carbon neutral that many of our client organizations need to go through requires that they are going to show that their supply chain is part of what they count in their carbon status. And so many of our clients are turning and saying, hey, warning, in a year or two, we're going to expect all our suppliers to be net zero so that we can meet our goals. And so that's coming quickly. And then the last thing that I hope speaks to the question is, for all the member firms that are watching, if you haven't checked out your own Dun & Bradstreet report recently, you need to go do that. There is now an ESG rating for every Dun & Bradstreet report. And so you have an ESG rating, and your customers are looking at that when they run you in that system. So I think that the time is now. I really think it has to be today and really last Tuesday that you're working on this. And so I would really encourage everyone watching, don't wait, don't put it off.
Dave, I wanted to thank you for that. I did not know that myself, and that's something I want to check out.
Yeah, this movement is so big out in the more public company world, and it's impacting all the supply chains, which is many of us in that supply chain. Dave or Raj, let me ask you a question. Just following up quickly. You guys talked about, and so did Lindsay, becoming a broader look at environmental than in the old days, to characterize the way Raj described. I think I don't know if he used the word Stone Age, but in the way we were old school, I think. We typically, a lot of big civil firms had an environmental department that did maybe NEPA work and things like that. And we had maybe a community planning group that did some of the services that Lindsay would procure on a routine basis. But it was the environmental knowledge was kind of limited to those kinds of groups. I'm hearing you guys mention, talk about that just isn't going to cut it anymore. That has to be broad knowledge in the firm. Can both of you guys just describe how you go about doing that, and if you agree with that?
I'll take a stab at that first for you, Kevin. What I've seen across the industry is that all of the forces that are coming together. We have all the ESG forces. We have the great retirement wave and the great resignation. And I think that's put a lot of pressure on our client organizations to change all at once. And it does drive us to think a little more holistically about their solutions. And I think Lindsay said it well. They want us to help them grow. And so that departmentalized alignment that you talk about, I grew up in it as well, Kevin, where you really, I think in a business sense, we call them silos. And it was a place to create excellence, and you had a lot of quality control, and it was probably, frankly, easy to track the productivity of all our people. But it becomes difficult to service clients holistically in that setup. So what I've seen is more of a move to rather than rigid departments. Oftentimes there'll be one big home room of services, and then these teams are put together for specific clients or specific projects out of that. They form, they're very multidisciplinary. There's often a planner mindset that may lead that team. And then when that work is over, that team disbands and new teams will be formed for new problems. So it's a much more flexible system. And I think that's been the trend among really probably the medium to larger sized firms. For the smaller firms who are members, you probably already live this naturally because you get to really collaborate in a very face-to-face way. And in many ways, the smaller firms are probably already at an advantage.
Sure, they'll be happy to hear that, Dave. Raj, any final thoughts on this topic?
I just think that we all need to stay on the cutting edge of how the industries are evolving. And some of the engineers in Jensen Hughes are kind of stuck, doing the same stuff that they've done for years, and that's their comfort zone. And we have a different population that is really helping, one, shape the standards in our industry, but two, just kind of evolving with different business model and technology changes out there. And two examples, one is on energy storage systems, with all the drive for renewables and all this battery, the scaling of lithium ion batteries, it just poses a big fire and explosion risk. And there's so many people in the value chain that have their own intentions. You have manufacturers and testing agencies, and you have authorities, and you have integrators and end users of energy, and the storage of that and the safety of that is viewed differently across that value chain. And it takes a skill set and a curiosity of folks to make sure they totally understand and the human dynamics and what all the stakeholders really want. And I would say that, so we found those populations of folks internally that really want to be on that cutting edge and really want to help move markets and shape markets, and have allotted them on these types of projects. And it's different. It's just not the same old, an architect is building a building and we're helping on code and designing the sprinkler system and the fire alarm system and whatever. These are completely new threats and hazards, and really interesting ones for our team. So we're just looking at people that really want to be on the cutting edge and serving our clients that way.
Awesome answer, Raj. Lindsay, I'd like to follow up. Joe posed a question. I'd like to kind of ask it in a different way. We talked about procurement and the way you're moving your procurement process at Fort Collins. Are you trying to get at your suppliers in a deeper way to understand, does the whole firm cognizant of these issues in environmental sustainability? Do they have it deeper inbred into the firm, or do they just have a couple of experts that can check a box and provide some expertise, but the whole firm is not, passionate about this topic? Where do you sit on that issue, and are you starting to take a look at that in picking vendors and engineers?
I really appreciate that question, and it's one that I'd probably want to do a little bit of thinking on. I don't know that it's so much, is this in 5% of your firm or 95% of your firm that we're looking at, but it does show up, right? If this is a cutting edge space for you, where it's just something you're testing, we can normally tell that in an interview, right? So are you just, sharing sort of the latest talking points on climate resilience? We know those too, and so we can speak those. So I think, we rarely go through a process without an interview. And I think though that's really when your depth can show up. And we in particular, we are looking for all voices to be heard in an interview, particularly when you're bringing in subs. So if, for instance, diversity and inclusion is a brand new space for you, and so you've brought in a sub to speak on that, I've had interviews with firms that don't even have that person speak. Well, what is that reinforcing, right? That this isn't a priority for you. And so it's great, I'll listen to your principal all day long, but I want to hear, how are you bringing in new voices to the conversation? So I think we get a lot of that out of interviews. I don't know that it's as scientific of a process as maybe as one might think at this point, but the interview process and who speaks and how much of a breadth that commitment is, whether that's environmental commitment, and you can see that for me, I can see that in the proposals too. There's a pretty big range of how folks respond to questions in our proposals around sustainability of their firm. So you can see that depth and commitment. And I'll tell you what, all of y'all on the call, it's okay for me if you're at that newer stage in this space, say it. Right? Say it's a burgeoning space, like that honesty and transparency. Transparency is pretty bread and butter to local government, right? So say it. Say this is a newer space for us, but this is where we want to head. So I think there's some real opportunities there, and how you're scaling it to your entire workforce is a great way to communicate that, because that's how we really institutionalize change.
Awesome answer. Let me ask Dave and Raj, I think we've all made a mistake of not reading the audience when we've done the presentations. And what are you guys doing to institutionalize best practices? As Lindsay said, who's going to these presentations, who's speaking, what are they speaking about? And what type of guide rails are you putting into your firms to, get the best message out there to represent your firm? Dave, why don't you go first?
Sure. What Lindsay's speaking to, I think, is really an alignment of values as well as experience. And that's very much what we see driving the work in our space now. And there are a number of reasons for that. I think there's a heightened social awareness around issues. I think the stakeholders that our clients are catering to care about these things, whether it's customers or community members. And so I think the important thing, frankly, from the very highest level of answer to your question, Kevin, is as firms, we need to enunciate our values, and then we need to drive that down into what we do. And that needs to be real, not just lip service. And if you're a big enough firm that you've got staff members under the age of 30, they care about it too, and you probably won't retain them if you're not doing that. And so I think that it's good business and it's good for society that we are all becoming value-driven firms. And then I think when we go to speak to our clients about that, and for the member firms that are listening, we are absolutely seeing interviews become Q&A only more and more for this reason. They don't want to hear a spiel. They want to talk with you and they want to feel out how you are coming through on these issues. I do think it's about transparency, and we work with our people to make sure they understand that, they can speak to that. But importantly, as firm leaders, all our people need to see that we walk that walk every day. And I think that's probably the most important thing that we can all do.
Thanks, Raj.
Yeah, I mean, if we just got, I'm going to get a little bit more tactical than Dave. When we look at responding to RFPs and RFQs and how we appeal to potential clients, first of all, we stayed really focused on making sure we understand what the real problem to be solved is. And I can't tell you how many folks in the industry, Jensen Hughes included, so I'm not trying to preach, will submit proposals that just tell the client how great you are and very rarely address the actual problem that needs to be solved and how you're going to solve it and add value, et cetera. So that's number one. Number two, we then look for an unmet need or something the client may not know, may not have explicitly said they want to solve, but some more value that we can add. And we like to express that. And if you thought about a Venn diagram of like an unmet need from your client and your strengths and your competitors' weaknesses, the middle of that's kind of the sweet spot. So we'd like to focus in there. And then in shortlist interviews, I think a common pitfall is we often assign a project manager to a project, but then everybody else wants a speaking role in the interview, rather than giving the project manager 80% of the airtime, because that's who the client's going to be working with day in and day out. So those, we want to make sure that they have the majority of the presentation time. And guess what? If we're worried about how our project manager is going to fare in that interview, we probably have chosen the wrong PM to be on the job anyway. So it's those three things that I think are quite fundamental. Hopefully it's valuable to those listening, but I just stayed true to those three things when we're looking to compete on work. Dave, does any of that ring true tactically in your experience?
I think you captured it really well. I think it is about making sure that the whole representation of the team is in the interview and that they're all connected, because that is the team that the clients will work with every day. So I think you captured that really well.
Great, guys. Thanks. Joe, any questions out there?
Here's another good one. We have this series about ESG, environmental, social, and governance. Where does E fall in terms of its importance relative to the S and the G? And I think this is for all of you to answer, but I'll start with Lindsay.
Well, I appreciate this question. And one of my most favorite things to do is say, beware of false binaries, right? So this one to me feels like it could look like, well, environment should be over this one or that, but it's a system, right? And so we have a tool at the city that we call a triple bottom line analysis scan. I'm missing a word there. That's not the important part. But one of the most critical failures I think we could have is if we look at a project individually and we say, oh, the environmental benefits are really good here, but the economic and the social are terrible. So that means the system is bad. And so instead, what we have to look at is what's our entire portfolio. Sometimes, economic is going to win. And sometimes environment's going to be, how do we mitigate any harms, right? And sometimes environment is the priority. And again, it's mitigating the social and environmental harms. And how do we bring it up to a baseline, right? So I think it's a systems question much more than then that's really important for us to focus on as a client, as opposed to and be clear on an individual project, what your focus is, but the whole system has to really look across the different values every time.
I'll pile on a little bit, and Raj did a really amazing job a couple of answers ago about getting a Venn diagram in verbal description, which is certainly better than I can do. But very similar to what Lindsay just said, we kind of have a checklist that we keep in place for evaluating projects that is a Venn diagram, the E, the S, and the G. And we look at all the intersections, and we have a way in each project to rank the severity or importance of each of those. And it may be that the primary money on a project is spent on E issues. It may be that it's spent to address social questions, but they're so interrelated that you've got to track them all, even though there may be one or more primary areas of focus over the others. But I agree entirely with Lindsay. I don't think you can separate them entirely.
I look at it, well, what is our internal ESG program level importance is what the question was, as well as, our clients, right? And I think they are equally related, but I think we are all more mature in one area versus the other. So that's why my company may be more mature internally on the G, where risk management people by background. So we have all these governance systems and risk management systems in there. We're accelerating on the S through our DE&I initiatives, et cetera. And on the E, I think we have more runway ahead of us on, how we reduce carbon footprint and how we are better stewards of the environment as Jensen Hughes. I'm not talking about what we do for our clients. So I may be putting more emphasis on the E, but that's just because I'm more mature on the other areas. And I think the same goes for our clients. And ESG is becoming very integral to everyone's strategy. And the strategy obviously is fueled by vision and mission. At Jensen Hughes, we call it the purpose and principles. And when we had a session earlier, I think it was last week when we were just kind of kicking this around, it was our prep session, we kind of got really into how important it is to be purpose-led. So I'm going to kick it to Lindsay because she was awesome in this regard. But Lindsay, how does purpose play into this whole equation for you?
Well, yeah, and to set some context, since some of you weren't there, we were talking about, just the challenges that engineering space is facing around attracting and retaining talent. And we talked about how, you know, this of course is not something that's limited to the engineering field. This is a global challenge, right? February, over 4 million people left their jobs. And in our city government, we had our highest attrition rate that we've ever had. We had 13% leave the city last year. And so we're not calling it the Great Resignation anymore. We're calling it the employee revolution. And so we've always been a culture organization, but we're doubling down on that, right? So the flexibility and remote work is critical. 1 in 3 of our, we just did a recent survey, 1 in 3 of our colleagues would leave the city if they couldn't have flexibility in their work. And that's not, and I love this. Somebody asked a question of our HR department last week of, you know, do you see remote work as a privilege or an entitlement? And I love this, that our HR director answered, it's a reality.
Yeah.
That is our reality, right? And for those folks, one thing that we're doing is exploring, not everybody, and particularly in the engineering field, not everybody can work remotely, right? And so what benefits can your firm offer to give that flexibility for parents like me to go and attend a soccer game of my kids, right? To go to the doctor without losing pay. And so there's a lot of things I think that we can explore in this future of work. And I would just say, I mean, the purpose-driven work is huge. So, and this gets at inclusivity too. So MIT Sloan just did an article on this around what's driving the Great Resignation. Number one, I mean, toxic culture, right, is the reason that people are leaving. And the number one driver of toxic culture is disrespect. Number 2 is uninclusive, right? And so this is the work that we have to do. So how are you creating an inclusive culture in your firm, small or big, right? And how are you living that in your values? And how are you going to support folks? Because everybody walks into the workspace holding something very differently. And especially for our Black, Indigenous, and people of color colleagues, walking into predominantly white spaces is challenging. And there were some situations that they were able to avoid in the pandemic when they were able to work remotely. And so really, like, how are you going to have people return to the office if you are, right? How are you going to offer flexibility and that supportive culture that people need? So I'm happy to go in deeper. I could talk about this for another hour. But I know you all have examples too, and I'm curious if anybody in the audience has thoughts as well.
Dave?
I would just say, I really want to point out how amazing it is what Lindsay just said. 20 years ago, we would have talked about working with a community, and it would have been entirely about budgets and how are we going to work around the logistics of this project area. And now we're hearing folks say that they're focused on their purpose as an organization and what that means. And when we're hearing that from our community clients, I hope everyone on the other end of the webinar is paying attention, because that is what's driving things. And so I personally find that really fulfilling, but it's also a challenge. At the same time that we've had this employee revolution, which oftentimes means someone in my position is busier on a given day than I might have otherwise wanted to be at this point in my career, we still need to find the time to step back and think about our purpose every day, all the time, and how we're driving that into the organization. And so what I would really say is, for everyone who's watching, really as firm leaders and leaders in the industry, find a way to step back a little bit every week, every quarter, and think about how you're going to drive that purpose into your organizations and into the work that you do, because that is what is driving the industry at this point.
Wow. Great.
Yeah, and I don't want to be a broken record, but I also, first of all, Lindsay, thanks for your comments. And Dave, I also agree. It is all about purpose and values. And I didn't always think like that, but I certainly do now. And I think you need to live it as an organization, whether you're a municipality or whether you're an insurer or private consulting organization or whatever you are, you have to live your values or people are going to leave. We've seen that. I mean, everybody that I know is between 10 and 20% on their voluntary turnover. I think, Lindsay, you said 13% last year. We're kind of in the same hemisphere. And, you know, everything we do as leaders needs to come back to that common purpose and needs to be simple. And I would just say, if I could offer two pieces of advice, one is, if there are folks on the line who don't feel like they have a very well-defined purpose statement, or you could call it a mission, or whatever you call it, there's so many different words for it. Start by just listening to your people and asking one or two simple questions. Don't prepare more than that, and just be a good listener, and you will see some very common themes just rise to the surface. It's just really liberating to do as well. And secondly is, if I hear another comparison comparing the younger generation to our generation, and that we didn't work 40 hours, we worked 60 hours, and we were the last ones to leave at night, or whatever it may be, we got to get over that and just accept the fact that every generation is different. You know, when my generation was coming up, we were being compared to others, and it's not productive. We just got to relate to all the different types of psyches and the different types of folks we have in the organization. And there are great tools to do that, like a DISC assessment or a Hogan assessment or different things like that. I could talk about those things for an hour, but let's just stop comparing and start listening and start rallying people around your purpose, and great things happen, in my opinion.
Oh, Raj, I love that. Kevin, I want to add, well, maybe two more things. So y'all, my kids entered kindergarten in the pandemic, which meant that like I was dealing with virtual schooling and a lot of crying on a daily basis for, a long time. And so I think we need to celebrate the fact that we all have survived and we've made it through, and you might be pretty exhausted right now, almost cursed, but I don't know you as well. But I just we're exhausted, we're burned out, right? And so this idea that you need to level up and completely change is probably overwhelming if you're at stage one in this. And so I want to name that, because I felt that too. And so I'll give you a really easy action. Join TikTok. And literally follow some of the younger generations work around the HR space on TikTok. You will probably waste more time than you should. I now set a 5-minute timer on myself. It's a really good idea. I recommend it. But that's such a great way to hear voices of different folks, because we have so many more shared values across all generations than we give credit for. I love that, Raj. It's not about othering anyone. It's how we all have similar values and goals. How do we move forward? And somebody who's older now, right? Especially as the newer generation comes into my office, I'm testing out TikTok more. So highly recommend it, and manage yourself.
Awesome. Thanks, Lindsay. Moving in a slightly different direction, can this panel tell the audience about digital technology? What are you moving your firm to be able to supply clients with solutions using digital technology? And Lindsay, what are you doing with digital technology as a client?
I'll go first.
Okay, go ahead.
I can start off. I mean, I talked about it before. Jensen Hughes, we're we now say we're engineering, consulting, and technology. We just deeply believe in technology as being a value driver. And in our area, and I said this before, but I'll repeat it, is we think we can increase quality of the work that we do. We can achieve compliance because we're in a highly regulated and compliance type of industry. We can reduce risk, but the most important thing is driving operational efficiencies for our clients and for ourselves too. So getting more productive when we do our work, but then also, reducing the FTEs involved in a particular process for our clients, so they can redeploy their resourcing in other areas, and it positively impacts their financial statements. So we focus there. We have, over a dozen products that are in the market that we've commercialized. And I'll just tell you that whether you make your own technology or you acquire it or you partner with somebody else, it's just really hard to manage the change with engineers, not so much using it, one, but two, actually building it into the offering that we give to clients. It's just hard to manage the change and to move cheese, basically. So I would say for those who are on the line, I mean, we've kind of have a head start on it, but be very, very patient on the technology front. And it's not, we all want this super linear ROI, and like, we want this super linear kind of like, we're making progress and we're taking steps from point A to point B. And you'll get from point A to point B, but it may be like in this weird, crazy way. And you got to be patient, and you can't let your CFOs go crazy on you about where the tangible return is. But, digital twins and artificial intelligence or machine learning, and even for those who are on the product side, like the Internet of Things technology and sensorization, it's here. And I'm not that guy who's like going to say that we're going to wake up tomorrow and none of us are going to have jobs. Like, we are all going to have jobs, and there's still going to be a war for talent. But those who want to be on the front end of it need to be early adopters of the technology. So Dave, I chewed up a lot of time there. You want to pile onto that?
Yeah, I think you said all the right things. I'll add two pieces. One, I think technology, especially digital technology, is really two things. One, it's a productivity lifter. So we've already spoken a lot in this hour about how we're, down in headcount as an industry relative to the number of things that we all need to get done. And digital technology is a way to help solve that. And a great tactical example, we in our business are in the O&M space, and we're seeing a retirement wave of operators. And there's not as many people coming into the industry. And the way we're solving that is with AI. The plants can start to run themselves, and it's not hard to do, and it's not expensive to set it up. So don't be afraid of it. It's relatively easy. And then I think you said it well, Raj, it's about early adopters. And if you can find those, they'll put digital in place. And really what it allows you to do is create better answers to the questions. You'll get a lot more information. I think Lindsay talked about particulate monitors around the city and how quickly they can make decisions because of that. That's what digital technology will do. It will allow us to move faster and make better decisions.
Awesome. Joe, I'm going to ask you if there's one last question from the audience out there that you're monitoring.
Yeah, there's just one question I think that would be great to just get some maybe 30-second answers on. But for either smaller firms who are looking to get more work in this space, or larger firms who are trying to become more dominant, where do you go to get the business in this sort of new area of ESG?
I'll take a stab at that first. I would say every one of the clients that you're already touching is dealing with this at some level. Go in and listen to what they're dealing with, and then go back and think about what that would mean to you and how you could accelerate success for them. And that will open doors. People will welcome the fact that you want to help and that you want to bring some new things to the table. And I understand we're all in business. We need to generate revenue, but I think you'll see a revenue return just by going in and listening carefully on these issues to your existing clients.
Yeah, I agree. If your clients have publicly available strategic documents or statements around ESG, they're all online. Read up on those. If you're dealing with a different type of client base, ask them. If they have never heard of ESG, educate them, and just be a good listener and see where it goes from there. And I think a lot of new ideas will come up. So,
Lindsay, the final words.
We're all on the journey together. That's the bottom line, right? We're all learning, and reach out. I bet any of us would be willing to talk to anybody who joined today to do a follow-up if you have any further questions. So just thanks for the time, y'all, and the great questions and dialogue.
Thanks so much, Lindsay. Your Southern heritage has crept in. You're using y'all a lot lately.
Oh, yeah, I'm from Southern Ohio. It does it.
So Daphne, we'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Lindsay, Dave, Raj, for sharing your thoughtful insights. I'm anxious to see how many of our engineers will become TikTok stars at Lindsay's suggestion. So Lindsay, keep us posted if you see of any of them cropping in. A special shout out to the ACEC Research Institute donors who have made this roundtable possible. We invite you to each think about how you and your firm might support the Institute. We do have a short evaluation that we'll send you this afternoon, so please share your insights and experience with us. And be sure to join us for our session next Tuesday as we tackle the S in ESG. There's a QR code on your screen that will link you to the registration of this complimentary session. With that, have a great afternoon and stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.
Bye-bye. Thanks, guys.
Hi, everyone. Thanks.